Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, Roger and I will talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking about my favorite superhero, who also happens to be the greatest superhero. And the book I'm talking about happens to be the greatest Superman stories ever told. Yes, it's the greatest Superman stories ever told in this book here. So, this is actually an old book. This I bought in 1987. Well, it was either 1987 or 1988. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but it was around there. It was published in 87. And this was published at the time of Superman's 50th anniversary. So he had been around 50 years at this point. And it was published shortly after John Byrne, the famous comic book artist and writer John Byrne, moved from Marvel to DC specifically to revamp Superman. And so this was coming at an exciting time for Superman the character. All this other stuff going on. So, a bunch of people who were Superman creators and comic book writers and editors and that sort of thing, they all got together and decided to figure out what were the greatest Superman stories ever told. And they'll tell you, you know what, you're going to be disappointed in some things because some of your favorite Superman stories are not going to be in here. Of course, that's the way it goes in this type of collection. But are these, in fact, the greatest Superman stories ever told? Well, we're going to find out if they are. Now, this is not the only book of its kind, obviously, that's been published. There are others. Before that one, there was this book. This was Superman from the 30s to the 70s. So this was an early compilation of Superman stories published back in the olden days when there were not a lot of comic book compilations or collections. That's just not something that happened. Comic books pretty much only existed for the most part in floppy comics. And if you wanted to read back issues, you usually, you had to get back issues. But every once in a while, you'd have a collection like this one. And most of the stories in this are in black and white, just old-timey black and white. And there's some great stories. I mean, you can't argue with the contents of this volume because, this is a great volume. So this was the 30s to the 70s. Now, they did update that in the early 80s, and that was from the 30s to the 80s, which is the same book with some differences. They put some 1970s stuff in here. And they did an origin story, I think, from the 70s. They redid Superman's origin a few times. This is the one from the 70s. They reprinted that in color. But most of the other stories, well, all of the other stories, I believe, in this volume are in black and white. So this was just like the other one, only this is from the 30s to the 80s. So this was published in the early 80s. Then we got this one. And then in 2004, we got this. This is a much slimmer volume. This is Superman, the greatest stories ever told, to avoid confusion with the greatest Superman stories ever told. So this was a newer volume published in 2004, which had some newer stories in it. They changed up the contents. There were a couple things in this that were also in the earlier volume. There's actually a lot of good stuff in here. This has one of my favorite stories, the 3 Supermen from Krypton. So there was some good stuff in here. So Superman, the greatest stories ever told, with that Alex Ross cover. But then 2 years later, in 2006, they had Superman, the greatest stories ever told, Volume 2. Now they had to put this out in 2006. Because that oh-so-exciting film, Superman Returns, came out that year. Do you remember that movie? You probably don't remember Superman Returns, but it did come out that year, that movie did. So they had to put this out, volume 2. And again, some really cool stories in here. Has the Luthor, the team of Luthor and Brainiac. So that was probably worth a book right there. And a bunch of other really cool stories. You had to have the obligatory John Byrne story from the John Byrne revamp. Good volume, volume 2. Then, for the 75th anniversary, this one came out. Superman, a celebration of 75 years. And they actually, DC came out with a whole series of books. One for Batman, one for Wonder Woman. But this was for Superman for his 75th anniversary. And the production values are much nicer in this one than in the earlier volumes. Got the nice glossy, slick paper. It's just the nice hardcover edition. This is a really, really nice comic book with a bunch of really great stories in it. And it also has, this volume also has one of my favorite Superman stories of all time, the Super Duel in Space, which is Brainiac's first appearance. I love that story. That story is fantastic. So, I mean, this is a great book. So there was this. Then 80 years came along, and we had this. This is Action Comics, 80 Years of Superman. Now, this is specific to Action Comics. So a bunch of stories from Action Comics, which was the original home of Superman. And this is odd or different because it has a bunch of stories in here, or some stories in here, that don't feature Superman, but just some characters that were in Action Comics, because Action Comics had, other stories in it besides Superman when it first showed up. So it's kind of different in that way, but basically otherwise it's, another greatest Superman compilation and a really good one. Then, just this year, we have 85 Years of Superman. Now, this is a paperback that is really thick. This is over 400 pages of Superman stories, and the contents in this one are really good. The contents are for the most part different from some of those earlier volumes. Of course, there are some that have been duplicated, but again, this is a great collection. I mean, this collection is just awesome. So some great stuff in this. So you'll see there's been a few of these. But this is the one we're talking about today. 7 minutes in. Sorry. Anyway, this is the one we're talking about today. And I bought this when it came out, or soon after. And I had just recently started reading Superman in the comics. I'd been a fan of the Adventures of Superman television show. I liked the movies. But I had never really read Superman much in the comics. I was more a Marvel guy. But when John Byrne revamped Superman, for all the controversy of that revamp, that did get me into reading. That did get me to read Superman. It worked. John Byrne's revamp of Superman, I have to say, it worked from a commercial standpoint because it got people to read that comic book. And I'm not the only Superman fan who became a Superman because of John Byrne's revamp. But I didn't know anything about Superman's history because back in those days, again, if you wanted to read a lot of those older stories, if you didn't have, from the 70s from the 30s to the 70s or the 30s to the 80s, if you didn't have one of those hardcover books, you weren't going to read these stories. And I couldn't afford those old back issues from the 50s, and I didn't really even know what they were about. So when I read this was actually my initial education to Superman's older stuff. This has a Superboy story in it. I always thought Superboy was stupid because he's Superboy. Who wants to read about Superboy when you could read about Superman? Turns out Superboy was actually a pretty good comic book. But I didn't know that until I read this. So let's take a look at the contents of this real quick and just see if these stories are indeed the greatest Superman stories ever told. We have an introduction by John Byrne, who was the Superman guy at this moment. He just revamped the character. We have a story in here, introduction in here by Mark Gold, or Mike, excuse me, Mike Gold. And he talks about how they chose the stories in this volume. Then we have a Golden Age story, and this is not the first Luthor story, but it is a story that features Lex Luthor when he was just known as Luthor, where Lex Luthor and Superman end up having a contest to see who is more powerful, Superman with his super abilities or Luthor with his super scientific genius. Superman wins. Spoiler alert, sorry, Superman wins this contest. It's interesting that they chose that Golden Age story. Again, I don't think it was the best one from Luthor from those early days, but it was a good one, so I can't really argue it too much. Then we have a story with the Archer, who was one of the first costumed villains in Superman. And the Archer was just some guy who murdered people with arrows. So, you know, you wouldn't think he would be a great challenge to Superman, but it ends up being a pretty good story. Most of these old stories were pretty damn good. And Superman proving himself invulnerable. It was actually a good story, this one with the Archer. Was it one of the greatest Superman stories ever told? I don't know, but it's pretty good. Then we have this little bit. This was originally published. Where was this originally published? This little 2-page thing. It wasn't published in the Superman comic book. What If Superman Ended the War, which was from Look magazine in 1943. And basically, if Superman existed, Superman would end the war by grabbing Hitler and Stalin and bringing them in. That happens there. And then we have Superman's first battle against Mr. Mxyzptlk. Mxyzptlk from the fourth dimension, who's always causing all kinds of goofy mischief and trouble for Superman. This is his first story. It also happens to be the best Mxyzptlk story ever, and probably the only Mxyzptlk story that ever needed to exist. Of course, this character returned again and again and again. Never as effectively as in this first story. This first story was really, really, really good. Definitely, I think, one of the greatest Superman stories of all time. So, yeah, that's, I mean, without a doubt, that should be in there. Then we have the origin of Superman. So, Superman's origin was pretty sketchy when he first came out. It was like a couple pages. Just saying, you know what? Superman's dad knew the planet was going to blow up Krypton, and he sent his kid to Earth in a rocket ship. That was his origin. It was fleshed out more later on in the newspaper strip. And the newspaper strip is actually where we got the original origin story complete for the first time, with Superman's parents, then putting him in the rocket ship. The whole thing was in the newspaper strip. But here, from this late 40s story, the Superman comic book finally tells a more complete version of that story. We've got Jor-El there, warning that the planet was doomed. Nobody believes Jor-El because they think it's like global warming or something, and politicians never believe that kind of stuff from scientists who study this stuff and know what they're talking about. No, that can't be happening. No, it can't be happening. It's happening, and Krypton blew up. So of course we get this dramatic scene where Superman is put in the rocket and flown away. And so, like I said, this was the story that gave us all of these details in the comic book for the first time. Now, Superman's parents are much older than we normally think of them in this comic book. But it's really great. And I think part of the reason they're older is because so they can, die when he's still a young man going out into the world. Because, he can't have any ties in the olden days. But we do get some great scenes in this of Superman as a younger person discovering his powers and kind of learning about his powers. That was a really cool thing to see. And then we've got Superman's dad on his deathbed telling his son, hey man, use your powers for good. Use your powers for good. And Superman in his costume for the first time and by his parents' grave, tell him, yeah, I'm going to go out and use my powers for good and become Superman. This was, of course, before Superboy, and the origin changed again when Superboy showed up. They always were retconning things in the early Superman comics. And then we have a story where this is one of those Silver Age stories where Jimmy Olsen stumbles across a magic totem, and he has 3 wishes. He's going to wish for Superman, he's going to give Superman what he thinks Superman wants, and he keeps screwing it up, as always happens when you have 3 wishes. And in one of the wishes, we get an early version of Supergirl, because Superman wishes he had a companion to help him fight crime and such. And, we get a very early version of Supergirl. This is not the Supergirl who shows up later. I kind of wish this volume had that original Supergirl story where the actual Supergirl showed up. But this was really interesting. Was this story one of the greatest Superman stories ever told? Probably not, but it is fun. It was a fun story. Probably the third part, Superman's return to Krypton, by far the best part of the story. That's probably why that's in here, where Superman goes back in time and has kind of a Back to the Future moment with his parents. Almost literally, that's what happens. So it was good, so I can't argue that being in here. Then we have Clark Kent's college days. We have the story that kind of takes place between when Superman stopped being Superboy and became Superman. So that's kind of an important story. I can't argue that one either. Then we have the super key to Fort Superman, which is the Fortress of Solitude issue. Fortress of Solitude, which Superman stole from Doc Savage. What a thief. Anyway, so yeah, we have this Fortress of Solitude story, complete with the giant key that he uses to get into the Fortress of Solitude. We learn all about the Fortress of Solitude. He has a different room dedicated to all his friends. So, that's like here at the Manor. I have a different room dedicated to all my friends. I mean, just down the hall over there is the Book Time with Elvis room, where I have a big statue of Mark and a big statue of Elvis over there, and a bunch of pictures of Elvis and Mark from their BookTube channel. I have the same thing going on at Vaughn Manor, so it's not weird at all. It's not weird at all. And so, yeah, here we go. And there's a mysterious visitor. He doesn't know who it is. I'm not going to spoil for you who the mysterious visitor is. I mean, you will never figure it out on your own. It's a tough mystery. Then we have Superboy. This was the first Superboy story I ever read. This was the origin of Bizarro. And it's actually a really good story. I was shocked. It's a great story. And so Superboy basically has to kill Bizarro. Bizarro, they keep telling you in this story, isn't actually alive. But he sure acts alive. I mean, he's got emotions, he's got feelings. He sure seems alive to me, but, the scientist is telling Superboy, no, man, Bizarro's not alive. You can just kill him. It's fine. It's fine. He's not alive because I say so. So, things don't end up well for Bizarro, but it's a great Superboy story. The first Superboy story I ever read, and I actually still haven't read that many because most of them have not been reprinted. Then we have the girl in Superman's past. Superman falls in love for the first time. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but she turns out to be a mermaid. Damn! Sorry, Roger, I keep spoiling these stories. It's Lori Lamaris. Another LL character like Lana Lang and Lois Lane. Lori Lamaris, she turns out to be she's a mermaid. Of course she is. That's actually a great Superman story, and indeed it deserves to be in there. And then we get this 3-part story. We've got Superman of Two Worlds and other stuff going on. Does this even have an actual title? Is it Superman of Two Worlds? I don't know, but all kinds of stuff happens in this story. Another Silver Age story whose title I can't see. It's part 3 is Superman of Two Worlds, where Superman basically is looking at a monitor at things that might have happened on Krypton. And it's good, but I'm not sure it was great. Then we have the Night of the 31st, where basically it was a gimmick story where you just have to try to find out what's wrong in the different panels. Like Jimmy Olsen is in a tuxedo for no reason, and Superman's wearing Clark Kent's glasses. Stuff like that. It's okay. I don't think it's one of the greatest Superman stories of all time, like at all. But this one, Lex Luthor Hero, an imaginary tale, didn't actually take place. But they did that sometimes to tell you an imaginary story. This story is dynamite. This story is great. Lex Luthor Hero, where Lex Luthor, he reforms and becomes pals with Superman. You trust him, right? You totally trust Lex Luthor. I mean, if he says he reformed, he did, right? I mean, he wouldn't lie. He wouldn't lie and try to kill Superman, would he? He wouldn't try to trap Superman. He wouldn't try to trap Superman in a locked room and bathe him in the rays of kryptonite. He wouldn't do that. Of course he did. And he kills Superman. And they have a big funeral because this is an imaginary story. And Lex Luthor is like, ah ha ha, I've got it made now. There's no Kryptonian on Earth who can take care of me. I've got it made. Not quite. Not quite. Because Supergirl and Krypto the Superdog are still here. And basically Supergirl, who Superman was reserving as his secret weapon, shows up and grabs Lex Luthor. I was interrupted again, right when I was talking about Supergirl in this story. So Supergirl shows up and captures Lex Luthor, and he's shocked because he didn't know Supergirl existed because she was still in training because she was young. But she takes over for Superman in that story. She becomes the new top superhero on the planet because of course she would. We have the amazing story of Superman Red, Superman Blue. Be careful when you use a machine to boost your intelligence because you might end up two people. That is what this story tells you. Superman Red, Superman Blue. One wears red, one wears blue. It's an imaginary story. It didn't happen. And I'm kind of glad it didn't happen because I don't think it's that great of a story, frankly. But everybody else in the world loves this Superman story, I guess. Then we have the Forever People, man. It's the Forever People. This was a Jack Kirby story that showed up in Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. So it's a Jack Kirby story with the Forever People, and the Forever People meet Superman. And I don't think it's that great. I am kind of a heretic. I don't think a lot of this Jack Kirby stuff from DC was great. I think it was okay. The New God stuff was pretty good. But, a lot of this stuff was just kind of like, eh. I think they put it in there because, it's Jack Kirby. And Jack Kirby does Superman. And it, like I said, it's okay. There's some cool stuff in here. But best story, one of the greatest stories ever told? No, I don't think so. But must there be a Superman? In this story from the 1970s, the Guardians of the Universe, who created the Green Lantern Corps, they get a hold of Superman and they put doubts in his head because what's happened on Earth is that human beings have become too reliant on Superman to solve all of their major problems. And the Guardians of the Universe kind of make Superman aware of this in a much more complicated way than they really... I mean, they could have just told him, hey, Superman, maybe, let humans solve their own problems once in a while. But they have to do this in a really complicated way because otherwise Superman, I guess, wouldn't get it. And this whole story, Superman's like, yeah, I should let human beings solve their own problems once in a while. It's a good story. It's a good story. Is it one of the greatest Superman stories ever told? It must be because it's in literally every Superman anthology. So who knows? Maybe it is. I don't know. But I can tell you for a fact that the next story in this volume, for the man who has everything. What is that strange creature on Superman? Now, this story is written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Gibbons. That's right. The team who brought you Watchmen. They did this, I think this came out shortly before Watchmen did. And there are moments of this story that feel like Watchmen, actually, only involving DC Comics heroes who aren't, bitter and dark and awful like the Watchmen heroes are. But still, I think this story, it's fantastic. And this one I won't spoil because it's a great story. Also starring Batman, Robin, and Wonder Woman, who Superman needs to get him out of a tight jam. And Mongol there. This story is so good. And the artwork is so good. And like I said, I think this story is every bit as good as Watchmen, only much, much, much shorter. But it's that level of quality. It's just fantastic. And, again, this story, all by itself, Superman's a little pissed in this scene. He's a little pissed. You would be too if you were Superman. That story all by itself makes this volume worth it. And then, to round this volume off, we have the secret revealed from an early issue of Superman. Maybe it was issue 2 or 3 or something, I can't remember. Of Superman, where Lana Lang is horrifically tortured for no reason. So this is a John Byrne Superman story where Superman is super ineffectual and Lex Luthor, the horrible, evil businessman who used to be a scientist, kind of makes Superman look like a schmuck. But there are some great images of Superman as Superman's flying around and, has to avoid this electronic eye that escaped from one of the, Star Wars prequels. And he uses balloons for that. Balloons. They didn't have those in Star Wars. Anyway, turns out Lana Lang is captured and tortured because Lex Luthor knows that she is somehow, she knows something about Superman. And she's tortured. Superman can't do anything about it because there's no proof. I will reveal this one because it's so dumb. So basically, Lex Luthor's computer comes up with the answer. Basically, the answer is Clark Kent and Superman are the same person. And Lex Luthor is like, no, they're not. They're not the same person. No, they're not. One wears glasses. Come on now. It's about that dumb. Frankly, it's not. They had to put a John Byrne story in here. I don't know why they put that one in there because he has better stories. The artwork's good, but I don't know why they put the story where Lana Lang is tortured and Superman can't do anything about it and he just looks like a big loser. So I don't know why that's in here other than maybe John Byrne liked it. There are other John Byrne stories that could have been in here. I would argue none of them are the greatest Superman story ever told. But if you need to have that era represented, and you probably do because it was so important, that's not the story I would put, at all. Altogether, an excellent volume. It's fantastic. And I look forward to seeing what Steve Donoghue has to say. His video will probably be even longer than this one. More people will probably watch his. We'll see. But that was the greatest Superman stories ever told according to the people who made this volume back in 1987. I have my own ideas about this. Steve Donoghue has his own ideas about this. So the week after next, I'm going to try to convince Steve to do a video where we talk about our favorite Superman stories. I'll talk about my favorite Superman stories. Steve will talk about his favorite Superman stories and why there are our favorites. That'll come the week after next. Next week, it's going to be a special June on the Range edition of Epic Comic Book Wednesday. And I will finally shut up. Okay, guys, I will see you next time.